From the New York Times, we'd like to welcome everybody to Rethinking the Electoral College, a learning network panel for students. I'm Ross Flatt, Professional Development Manager.
We're very excited to be joined by so many of you from across the country today. So let's get started. We have three goals for today's panel. The first is to simply describe the Electoral College and its historical role in the United States. We are also going to analyze the role and relevance of the Electoral College in current elections. And we're also going to think critically about whether the Electoral College should be reformed. During today's panel, we asked students around the country to send us questions through Flipgrid. So we'll be viewing those student questions throughout today's panel. And to help us answer those questions, we have New York Times panelists. We have two, and they will be here to discuss with me the student questions. After we have a more formal discussion, we're going to open up the panel to questions from the audience. All right, so without further ado, I would like to take a moment to welcome today's panelists. We are joined today by Allyson, Waller, and Jesse Wegman. So I'm going to ask Allyson and Jesse to come on and join us today. Hi, Allyson. Hi, Jesse. How are you two doing?
Good.
Good, thanks.
All right. So I just want to introduce the two of you. Allyson is part of the 2020-21 New York Times Fellowship class and is a general assignment reporter on the Express desk. And Jesse is a member of the New York Times Editorial Board, where he has written about the Supreme Court and legal affairs since 2013. He's the author of the book, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. So first off, we wanted to thank you both for joining us today. And we just want to take a few minutes to learn a little bit more about your roles at the Times, because you occupy two very different spaces. So Allyson, let's start with you. Can you just briefly tell us about the New York Times Newsroom?
Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Allyson Waller, and like Ross said, I'm a fellow at the Times, and I'm a reporter on the Express desk, which functions as kind of the breaking news desk for the Times, and also looks at trending news online and provides explainers on complex topics like the Electoral College. The New York Times Newsroom as a whole has various desks, like the Express desk, desk on politics, culture, style, climate, all sorts of things, with over 1,000 journalists. And we operate independently from the Times Editorial Board and its opinion section. So we do not write op-eds. We don't have any influence on what op-eds get written. So our job is to, report the truth, seek out the truth, and just to make sure people stay informed.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned that you write explainers. So one of the things that we asked students to read before joining today's panel was this explainer you wrote on the Electoral College. So can you just very briefly tell us what made you interested in writing about this topic?
Yes, well, of course, with the upcoming 2020 presidential election, and also this upcoming election will be my second time voting in a presidential election. My first time was in 2016. And so the Electoral College has always, or I wouldn't say always, when I started actually getting ready to vote is when my interest grew in the Electoral College. And I do think it's something that can be a bit confusing, especially for first-time voters. And so I was just really interested in helping people further understand the Electoral College. Even I think every 4 years, it's something that I think people should have a refresher on. So I was just inspired as a voter myself to do what I could to help explain it better to people.
Yeah, I think you break it down really well. And a lot of our students had some questions about the types of things that you described. So we're going to be diving into that in just a bit. So before we do that, though, I'm going to just turn things over to Jesse. So Jesse, you're a member of the Editorial Board at the Times. How is that different than the Newsroom?
Hi. Well, right. As Allyson explained, the Newsroom and the Opinion Department are two completely separate places at the Times. We're on different floors. We don't really talk to each other. The opinion section, of which the Editorial Board is a part, is there precisely to express opinions, to take sides, to weigh in with how we think things should be rather than just to describe how they are, which is what the newsroom's job is. So the editorial board is a group of about 10 or so members, depending on how we count. And it also has some editors. And the picture that you see on your screen, that was from last year in December. We met with all of the, at the time, Democratic candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. And they all came into our boardroom there, and we got to talk to them and interview them. And they turned it into a hour-long show, which was fun, and I recommend watching it just so you can see how the editorial board talks and thinks and interacts. We meet as a board, several times a week, and we talk about what we want to weigh in on, what issues we want to express our opinion on. And our editorials are usually unsigned, meaning they are expressing the institutional voice of the New York Times. They are not my voice or one of my colleagues' voices. However, sometimes we also do write pieces under our own names. And in those situations, those tend to be about issues that we are more expert in than maybe our colleagues are. And so we have more thoughts about them or have something we want to say that isn't a position that the whole board would necessarily take. So, editorials have been around since the beginning of newspapers, and they are, I think, a really useful and helpful way to help regular people just read and think about the news, not just read what's being said, not just read what's being reported, but think about, well, how should I think about this? And when they come to trust the voice or the politics or the ideology of a particular type of board, then they can sort of help be guided in how they think about the news by that board. Different papers have different types of boards that take different types of political positions. Just to reiterate what we said at the beginning, we are not the newsroom. The newsroom does not take political positions. What we do is a completely separate activity, even though it exists in the same paper.
Thank you very much. So, you mentioned that sometimes the editorial board will sort of kind of write something under your collective name, and other times you write about things that are of interest to you. So very quickly, before we go into student questions, clearly the Editorial College is something that is of interest to you. You literally wrote a book on it. You were actually on the Daily this morning talking about the Electoral College. So can you just tell us briefly, what is it about the Electoral College that intrigues you so much?
Well, it's funny, I was listening to Allyson speak, and she pointed out, I think you said, Allyson, that 2016 was your first election in which you were able to vote. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, that's amazing. So Allyson's experience of voting for president, 100% of her experience in voting for president consists of an election in which the candidate who got fewer votes became the president. For anyone who's come of age in the last 20 years, that's happened twice in 5 elections. The candidate who won fewer votes in the country became the president. I think that's a pretty shocking thing for people to come to face about what they thought was their representative democracy, right? I think we all sort of have in our hearts this idea that majority rule is the principle on which our democracy runs, right? That if somebody wins more votes, they win the election. And yet that hasn't happened nearly half of the elections in the 21st century. So I felt like, well, that's something that a lot of people get upset about. In fact, it looks like a partisan issue because both times that it's happened in the 21st century, the same party has benefited from the way the Electoral College happens to undermine the popular vote. But I really think it's not a partisan issue, or it shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's actually harmful. The way the Electoral College functions today is harmful to all Americans. And I wrote the book in large part to help people understand where it came from, why it's harmful to Americans today, and how we can change it to make our system of selecting the president more representative and more accurately reflective of where the majority of Americans are.
Okay. And so that's something that I think the students are really curious to know about. And it is really interesting that it's not clearly a partisan issue. It seems that way, but it is very, very interesting how, it's really been something that whoever it benefits seems to be in favor of it as we're going. So let's just start, at the ground level with a general understanding of the Electoral College. What is it? how is it different than the popular vote? And instead of just kind of launching right into that, we're going to go to our first student question, and this is from Sarah. Let's hear her question.
Hello, my name is Sarah Alford, and I attend Maynard High School in Maynard, Massachusetts. My question is to Allyson Waller, and my question is, why is the popular vote used to elect members of Congress, state legislators, governors, mayors, and others, but is not used in the presidential election?
Okay, so Allyson, I'll kick it over to you.
Okay, cool, great. So the reason that the popular vote is not used in the presidential election, simple answer is because in the Constitution, the founders had established that the Electoral College would be the way in which the country chooses its president and vice president. Going back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, one of the things that the framers had to figure out was how the United States was going to choose its president. And, there were various ideas that came along. There was the idea to give the job to Congress to choose the president. But some thought that would make the presidency too dependent on Congress, and therefore there wouldn't be enough separation of powers. There was, of course, too, the idea of doing a direct popular vote, but also some also thought that maybe the American people weren't informed enough or educated enough to make a vote on a national leader, mainly because so many people were plugged into their local states and their local leaders. And two, there wasn't the mass communication that we have today. People couldn't quickly Google things or quickly learn about candidates that were running for president and vice president. So all that to say, the simple answer is because of the Constitution and what is written into the Constitution, and the Constitution being the supreme law of the land. And I don't know, Jesse, if you want to add more context to what I was saying.
Sure. That was a great summary. Thanks. And everything Allyson said is right. I guess here's how I would just add to that and expand on it a little bit. First of all, the framers of the Constitution, the delegates who met in Philadelphia that summer in 1787, were trying to do something that no one had ever done before, which was to create a large self-governing republic. That means a country that governed itself, was not ruled by a king like the colonists had been by the King of England, but actually got to govern itself and crucially got to elect its own leaders. They got to choose leaders to represent them. That's what it means to say we live in a republic. It's the same thing to say as we live in a representative democracy, is the people choose their own leaders, and then the leaders act on their behalf to pass laws and to set policies that then apply to everybody. That's the system. And what the framers were trying to do at that convention when they made this Constitution was decide what was the best way to choose the leader of the entire country, not the leader of the states, not the representatives in Congress, which, as Allyson rightly pointed out, are all they are popularly elected. There was no big struggle over that, right? That was something that was agreed on. But how to elect a president was a more fraught issue. It was something they fought over all the way through the convention. They started fighting about it in the first week, and they didn't finish fighting about it until the very end of the convention. And as Allyson said, some of the factors that were involved were the fact that they were concerned people might not know enough about, wouldn't know enough about their national political candidates to make a good choice or to make an informed choice. But another one that I think we really need to remember is the role of slavery, which was central to every decision that was made at the Constitutional Convention and every compromise that was struck. And particularly, the protection of the interests of the slave-holding states was really at the heart of the Constitution. And the slave-holding states got extra power out of the design of our federal government. Congress, the design of Congress gave them extra power for their slaves, even though those slaves could play no role in politics, they couldn't vote, they'd had no other human rights. The South got to count them toward their representation in Congress, and thus they got more power in Congress because of their slaves. They wanted that power to carry over into the choice of the president too. And the Electoral College did that because it allowed them to transfer over, because of the way the Electoral College is designed, which is states get a number of electoral votes that equal their representation in Congress. If they had more representation in Congress because of their slaves, they also got more electoral votes because of their slaves. So I think that's a really important thing to remember about how the Electoral College came to be and how it actually worked in the early years of the country. It gave extra power to the slave-holding states, which they continued to hold for a very long time. So we can talk more about that, but I will just, that's all I would just, for now, like to say, to add some context, more context to what Allyson very nicely put.
I think that's a great point. And one thing that does come up is, this idea of, who are these electors and, what can they do and when do they do this? So we have another question from Azalea that kind of talks about that. So let's listen to Azalea.
Hi, my name is Azalea Thompson. I attend Boston Latin School in Boston, Massachusetts. My question is for Ms. Waller. In the event of a very close popular election and enough faithless electors, could the December 14th results be different from the projections that were made after the popular vote on November 3rd? And what would the repercussions of this be? And do you think it would ever happen?
All right, to get started. So in the event that electors, when they meet on December 14th, it is possible that the results, could be different than the projections that are given after Election Day. Sometimes, and it has happened before in 2016, but not enough to where it changed the outcome of the election. In 2016, 7 electors decided to vote for a candidate that they weren't pledged to cast their vote for. It didn't change the outcome of the election, but in theory, if electors, didn't vote for the candidate they were pledged to vote for, which is what a faithless elector is. I should have started with that. A faithless elector is basically an elector who decides to vote for someone that they haven't pledged to vote for on their party's ticket. In theory, it could happen. And if there were, say, enough faithless electors, it could sway the results of the election or like what's predicted after Election Day on November 3rd. It's possible that there could be a certain amount that could definitely change those projections or what is expected. But currently, because, we operate, or 48 states operate under, and Washington, D.C. operates under a winner-take-all basis, it's kind of predicted that there wouldn't be a ton of electors changing their decision or changing their pledges.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, Jesse, please add. Is this even feasible?
So the quick answer is no, it won't happen. So don't worry about faithless electors; it won't happen. But the questioner, Azalea, I think was her name. It was a very smart question, and because I think it gets at a core misunderstanding about the Electoral College, which is the Electoral College that the framers designed and put in the Constitution almost never operated the way that they thought that it would, and it certainly doesn't operate the way they thought it would today. And the faithless elector question that you ask is really a perfect example of how that is. So when they made the Electoral College at the Constitutional Convention, the way they explained it to the people, when they sent out the Constitution to get ratified by the states and to begin the United States of America, the way they explained it to the people was to say, we've established a body of educated and thoughtful and deliberative men, and it was, of course, only men at that time, who will take this grave and solemn task to heart, and they will sit down and they will deliberate over the options that they have, and they will choose the man, again, only men, who is the best to lead the country, right? The Electoral College has never actually worked that way. So George Washington was elected president by the Electoral College unanimously, both in his first and his second terms. But then when he decided not to run again, in 1796, the third presidential election, already something had happened in the country that the founders were not anticipating, which was the rise of national political parties. Today we call them Democrats, Republicans, but they've had different names throughout history. The rise of national political parties completely blew up the founders' idea of what the Electoral College would be. Instead of a body of thoughtful men deliberating over who would be the best person to lead the country, it became a team sport. It became one side against the other. And electors stand for one candidate or another. That's who they are. It's not like each state has this body of thoughtful men sitting around and waiting to decide. It's that the Democrat has Democratic electors, the Republican has Republican electors. And if a state has more popular votes for the Democrat, then they get to send all of their Democratic electors to the state capitol, and then on December 14th, those electors vote. The reason that they're not going to go be faithless is that they want to vote for that candidate. They were chosen. They are not careful, deliberative people today. They're just regular Americans like you or me who happen to know somebody in state politics and were given a phone call. They get a phone call sometime earlier this year and they say, hey, do you want to be on the Electoral College? Do you want to be an elector this year, a presidential elector? And the person says, sure, I'll do it. And they're chosen because they want to vote for their candidate. So while there have been a few faithless electors in American history, and there were 7, as Allyson rightly said, in 2016, that's still a tiny fraction of the number of electors who've cast ballots throughout American history. In fact, most of them want to vote for their candidate, and most states have laws requiring them to vote for their candidate. And this year, just a few months ago, the Supreme Court issued a big decision about this very topic, saying that states have the right to tell electors how to vote. And if electors don't vote the way that they want, they're allowed to replace them or punish them and replace them with people who will vote the way they want them to vote. So all of this is just about really partisan politics, and faithless electors are just never going to swing the results of an election. So I don't think you have to worry about that.
Yeah, and electors, I mean, they're chosen because, like Jesse said, their loyalty to the party. So I don't think it would get to a bunch of them going against their party's wishes.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about historical context, and we started talking about this a little bit, but Sarah has a question a little bit more about how it's worked. Let's hear her.
Hello, my name is Sarah Faraj, and I attend Burlington City High School in New Jersey. My question is for Allyson Walker. Do you feel as though the Electoral College works as it was intended to?
To quickly answer that question, no. I don't think it worked as the framers intended. To go back to what Jesse was saying earlier, I don't think they had foresaw how much the two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, would reflect the way in which it operates today. And also, the fact to, like, in the Constitution, yes, the Electoral College is written in there as the way to elect the president, vice president, but a lot of the ways and rules in which those electors are chosen and how they are represented is left up to the states, and so therefore I don't also think that the framers foresaw this winner-take-all system where, say, the winner of a popular vote in a state gets all of that state's electors. I think the framers had intended it for it to be more of it based on kind of a district type basis. So like today, 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, they operate on a district type basis where the winner of the whole state gets 2 of the state's electors, but the winner of a congressional district in the state gets an elector. So I don't think that the Electoral College, and there's other things too, and Jesse, feel free to jump in, but I honestly, personally don't believe that the Electoral College is operating in the way that the original intent of the framers had.
Well, just for starters, I'll say this, and before I do, I just want to comment briefly on the questions that are popping up in the Q&A box below. There are dozens of them. They're really great questions. They're such smart questions, and I'm sorry in advance if we're not able to get to all of them, but I just want to emphasize that they're really good questions, and you're asking the right questions, you're asking smart questions, and I wish we could get to every single one of them in time. But just to follow on what everything Allyson said is right. I'll just make the about that winner take all rule. I think it's one of the things we can say is the framers weren't sitting around looking at a map of red and blue states. That was just not something they ever talked about. They did not think about the winner take all rule, which is what all states but Nebraska and Maine use today, was never discussed at the Constitutional Convention. The winner take all rule, just to be clear, in case you don't know what it is a decision, it is a choice by the state to give all of its electors to whichever candidate wins the most votes in that state. The candidate doesn't have to win a majority. They don't have to win by any number of votes. They could win by a single vote, and they would get all of that state's electors. So many of you may not have been around for this, but in 2000, the last time the Electoral College, before 2016, the Electoral College went against the popular vote, in Florida, there were 6 million voters in Florida. 6 million people cast a vote in Florida. The difference between the two candidates, George W. Bush and Al Gore, was 537 votes when the counting was stopped. 537 votes. Florida has 25 electors, a huge number of electors. And all 25 of those electors went to George W. Bush and 0 to Al Gore, even though their difference in the statewide vote was essentially nothing. They were basically tied in the state. It was as though all of Florida's voters had voted for George W. Bush and none of them had voted for Al Gore. That winner-take-all system was never contemplated by the framers. And when states started adopting it early in the country's life, the framers who saw it happening were pretty upset by it. James Madison, who we can think of today as the father of the Constitution, he wrote the first draft. He was one of the most influential framers of all. He saw it happening, and he actually proposed a constitutional amendment banning the practice of winner take all, precisely because of this way that it distorts a state's voice by eliminating all of the people who didn't vote for the top vote-getting candidate. He didn't succeed in passing that amendment, but it just goes to show that the way the system operates today is not what the founders thought they were making. And the one other one I think that's really important to remember is that they didn't necessarily think that people, regular Americans, were going to play any role at all in voting for the president. States could choose. They left it to states to choose whether to let people vote at all in the presidential election. All states do that now, and so we assume that that's just the way the Electoral College is. It doesn't have to be. States can change their rules about how they award their electors. They can also change their rules about picking them in the first place. And they can leave regular citizens completely out of it, and that's entirely constitutional.
While we're thinking about, there's moments like you said where Madison kind of saw what was happening to this sort of, I guess, Frankenstein that him and the other founders have created. We have another question that kind of gets to that. So this is from Asher.
Hello, my name is Asher Abreu, and I attend Lake Oswego High School in Lake Oswego, Oregon. My question is for Mr. Wegman. Can you pinpoint a moment in time when you realized that the Electoral College voting system was not a just way to elect the president?
Thanks, Asher. December 7th, 2000. That was election night of 2000. That was when we discovered that, in fact, I think a lot of people just weren't even aware of what the Electoral College was or how it worked. And then we learned to our shock that, in fact, the candidate who won fewer votes in the country could still become the president. I think that was what really, I was 27 at that time. So I'd already voted in, that was my third presidential election. And it was really just a complete shock to us all. And it started me thinking about the strangeness of this system and why we had it and how much it kind of undermined the way our representative democracy is supposed to work. The fact that it happened again in 2016 only drove that point home further. And I think that's a really important thing for people to remember, is that it wasn't like everyone was just okay with the Electoral College until last year or a few years ago. By a long shot, there have been more efforts to change or abolish the system we have for electing the president than for any other part of the Constitution. 800 attempts in Congress since the beginning of the country. I just think that's a reminder to people that people have been upset with this system all the way through.
We're going to just move right on to the final set of pre-recorded student questions. So let's really talk a little bit more about rethinking the Electoral College. So our first question is from Lauren. So let's take a look at Lauren's question.
Hi, my name is Lauren Phillip, and I attend Cranbrook Kingswood in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. My question is for Mr. Wegman. In your video about the Electoral College, you mentioned a way to essentially fix the problem with the Electoral College and bring the power of selecting the next president back to the people. If this is being made possible by the individual states granting their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, why not just get rid of the Electoral College altogether? Thank you.
This is a great question. Thank you. So here's the answer. Remember, I just said how there have been 800 attempts in Congress to amend or abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a national popular vote. Those have been efforts to amend the Constitution. We actually came extremely close to succeeding in this, as this picture shows, where Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana actually led a push to abolish the Electoral College and got really, really close. They passed it in the House of Representatives. It's the only time in American history that a House of Congress has voted to abolish the Electoral College. And it got stopped in the Senate by a filibuster, which you may know about. It's a way of basically postponing debate until a bill or a piece of legislation dies. It was stopped by Southern segregationists. So once again, remember the Electoral College began with in a negotiation that involved protecting the interests of slaveholding states. You had these men in the 1960s who were literally the descendants of slaveholders themselves, who were still blocking any reform to a national popular vote. So I think the sort of racial element of this is really carries all the way through American history. But to answer, so the questioner had a really good, was asking about this effort to use the Electoral College in a way to get us to a popular vote today. And I won't go into the details of that right now because it takes a little while to explain, but it's actually been developing for about 15 years. And it is a means of not amending the Constitution, but of using the Electoral College as it is currently designed in the Constitution for states to award, to basically get us to a popular vote election. The reason to do that instead of just taking the Electoral College out of the Constitution is that I think we've now seen, after 200 years of attempts and 800 efforts, that getting a constitutional amendment passed on this issue is extremely hard, if not impossible. And so people have been thinking about other ways to get us to a national popular vote, and this is one of them. It's really about what is politically practical to get us to an outcome that I think would be better for all Americans.
Okay, and so let's think. So I think thinking about all Americans is really important with this one. I know this is a little bit more of a complicated answer, but I'm wondering if, kind of quickly we could respond to Aiden's question here.
Hi, my name is Aiden Chen. I'm a junior at the Boston Land School in Boston, Massachusetts. I have a question for Mr. Wegman and Ms. Waller. You mentioned that the Electoral College helps to protect smaller states such as Rhode Island and Wyoming. So do you think that in the event of a switch to the popular vote, candidates would instead focus on the issues of states with larger populations, such as California and New York, and in turn, smaller states would be ignored?
I can go first on that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think, in a sense, if we were to change to a popular vote, that smaller states would necessarily be ignored. But I do think that candidates would have to change the way in which they approach issues. Issues would have to be on a more national scale. I think the reason as to why there's a lot of focus on particular states is because they are battleground states and they are winner take all. So that means candidates are focused on these handful of 3 to 5 states or so, instead of looking at the overarching picture of maybe the issues that the country as a whole are interested in. I don't think they would only focus on issues that are like particular to larger states. There is the belief that, smaller states have an advantage in the Electoral College. But and that, that's a valid argument that people do have. But I think there probably should be greater emphasis on how the winner-take-all system kind of has more of effect and leads candidates to focus on specific states and make them battleground states.
So can I add to that a little bit?
Very quickly.
Yeah, the video just went out. The Electoral College, as it functions today, does not protect small states, and I think that's just a misunderstanding that's existed for a long time. As Allyson said, it protects battleground states. Battleground states are states where the vote is very close, and candidates can actually help move it one way or the other, and therefore win that state's entire pot of electoral votes. Remember, that's the winner-take-all rule. So they focus on those states, as Allyson said, to the exclusion of all the other states. Right now, it's not small states that are ignored, it's all states except battleground states that are ignored. When you have a popular vote, then the candidates actually have to pay attention to voters everywhere, in big states, in small states, in northern, southern, rural, urban, all states, because they need the most votes everywhere to win.
All right, this is a tough issue to solve. We do have a student who is kind of thinking a little bit about possible scenarios. So we're going to hear our last student question, and then we'll take some Q&A. So this is Jack.
Hi, my name is Jack Trapanik. I'm a student at Boston Latin School in Boston, Massachusetts, and my question is for Mr. Wegman. You proposed as a solution to the problems with the Electoral College, compelling electors to give all their votes to whichever candidate wins the popular vote. However, the only current functioning redress for the problems with the Electoral College are the paths that Maine and Nebraska have taken. So I was wondering to what extent you thought those paths were effective and useful, and whether you would support states adopting them.
So the path that he's talking about there, that Jack is talking about, is what I think Allyson referred to earlier is called the Congressional district method. And all that means is it's not winner take all. It's rather than the entire state going to one candidate or the other, the candidates win electors based on congressional districts. So there's one elector for each congressional district in every state. Whichever candidate wins a congressional district gets the elector for that district. And then the candidate who wins the whole state gets the two electors that represent the senators. First of all, just to clarify one thing about that question, it is not the only legal route or the only option right now. States can choose to award their electors however they please. They could do it right now by joining that. They join the Popular Vote Compact, but they don't have to be a member of the compact to choose to award their electors right now if they wanted to the winner of the national popular vote. That's completely constitutional. None is doing that right now because it wouldn't make sense to do it until they actually had enough to change the outcome of the election, which they wouldn't. But they can do it however they like. The reason I don't like the congressional district method is because it then brings in the problem of what we call gerrymandering, which is that districts don't necessarily reflect accurately the politics of their states, because politicians draw them, and they draw them in sneaky ways to keep themselves in power. So they draw district lines in very clever ways. Sometimes they look like, well, the famous one look like a salamander. That's why they call it a gerrymander. And it was done precisely to give more political power to certain people living in certain parts of the state and less political power to people not living in those parts. Right now, gerrymanders, except in Maine and Nebraska, don't have any effect on the presidential election. They only affect elections in Congress and in state legislatures. If you change to a congressional district method, as Maine and Nebraska have it all over the country, then gerrymanders and the distortions that they have already brought into our system of elections would now carry over into the presidential election, and I just don't think that's a good thing. I think gerrymanders are a really bad part of our politics, and I don't want them to spread their distortion any further than they already have.
We have questions for Allyson, we have questions for Jesse, we have questions for both. Let's go to this one. This question is, what are the potential risks if there is reform of the Electoral College?
I think one of the potential risks, like Jesse has touched on before, right now, the way that how electors are chosen is very much a state-focused thing. So states pretty much set the laws around voting. It's not a very national-wide thing. So say if we were to change to a national popular vote, there would have to be voting laws like on a national scale. And I think that would cause some argument among states and possibly politicians as well. One person in one state probably would not want the federal government to tell them how they can vote or what they would need to do. So I think that is like one potential risk that is possible if there was such a reform where we were able to go to a national popular vote.
Man, we have so many questions today. Another question is really about like the size of the country. We have a few that talk about this here. Somebody asked, is the country simply too big to have a winner-take-all approach?
That's a great question. When the founders built the country, when they established the Constitution, I think the population was around 4 million. And I'm not even sure if that's counting slaves. So it was tiny, just a fraction. I mean, what state has 4 million people today? That's smaller. 4 million is smaller than many states right now. And I think they never could have conceived of just how big the United States would become. Nevertheless, they were trying to build a system that would serve a sprawling, large, self-governing republic. So the question is, well, why couldn't it just keep doing that? And I think that the question is a really smart one because it raises the issue of whether a two-party system and a winner-take-all rule really is the best way to run a country of this size and this political diversity. You see other countries with other systems of government, parliamentary systems of government, where there are many more parties. They are represented in rough proportion to their support in the population, and they all get some role in the national legislature and sometimes in the executive branch too. They get to speak up. They get to coalition. They partner with other parties to pass certain types of legislation. I think there are certainly problems with that system of government, but people generally express a lot more satisfaction with their governments under those systems than under a winner-take-all two-party system like we have in America.
Okay, thank you for that. So many interesting hypotheticals here. This is an interesting one. This is something that I was a history teacher for over 10 years, and this is something that students would ask all the time. These hypotheticals, these like what if scenarios that historians hate playing out, but they're fun. What would have happened if the Electoral College never existed? I guess is the assumption that we would have had a national popular vote in its place if it hadn't happened? Yeah, I guess like do either of you think about sort of the course of history and how and how the Electoral College has impacted it?
Sure. That's a tough one. I mean, a lot there's a lot of things that would be different. The Electoral College, if we had a popular vote, I mean, the way the framers thought about a popular vote, the way they thought about who the people were was so different from the way we think about it today anyway, that it's a little hard to answer that question. They didn't think women, they didn't give women the vote. Obviously, enslaved Black people couldn't vote. Native Americans couldn't vote. Poorer white people couldn't vote. So then even at the time, if you had called it a popular vote and you said to them, shouldn't we have a popular vote? They would say, well, it really only refers to a tiny fraction of the population, wealthy white men, right? They were themselves wealthy white men. So I don't know. I find it's a bit of a hard hypothetical to engage because there's so much about the country that was different than it's not just the Electoral College. It's basically all their assumptions about who was part of our democracy.
True. And I kind of do wonder too if like the two-party system would be where it is today. If, say, we were doing if there was a national popular vote, would there be so much emphasis or
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
This one person asked, do you think future presidents will acknowledge the need to abolish the Electoral College? And I guess this kind of gets at this idea of, why isn't it happening, and what will it take for maybe people in office to make any sort of change around this?
Well, I'd like to, can I just invoke a little history here? Throughout
Yes.
American history, presidents have called for the abolition of the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson called for the abolition of the Electoral College. Richard Nixon called for the abolition of the Electoral College. Donald Trump, before he became president, called for the abolition of the Electoral College. And I think, that's just a reflection of how many people have seen how harmful this system is in practice. On the Republican side right now, you don't have any figures who are, I see in the foreseeable future, are saying that. But on the Democratic side, I think that in the sort of 10 or 12 final candidates who were running for the nomination, I think at least half of them had come out in favor of abolishing the college, as well as Hillary Clinton, obviously. So I think that I do think it's going to be an issue going forward, and I think it will, at least on the Democratic side, and I would hope eventually on the Republican side as well.
And I don't know either, Jesse, or if you seem like, based on doing my research and everything, it seems to come up depending on which party wins the presidency, how they feel about the Electoral College, if it should be abolished.
As a general rule, you're right. Although in 1968, Richard Nixon, the Republican, won the White House, and the next year he came out in favor of abolishing the Electoral College, which was the way that he won. So it doesn't always have to go that way.
All right. So this is a question really about voters. Would you say that the Electoral College helps enable voter suppression because people are unmotivated to vote as they feel like their vote might not count? I mean, I hear this all the time from folks. I live in New Jersey, which is reliably blue, from people who maybe don't want to vote here because it doesn't matter. What would you say to that?
Yes.
Yeah, same thing. I would say it's a pretty valid feeling. I even had friends that have told me in the 2016 election they didn't vote because they believe that their vote wouldn't count. And I think it goes all the way back to the winner take all system that majority of states operate under. If, for instance, Texas, it's been known as a reliable Republican state. So if it does, if the popular vote, in Texas, goes toward the Republican candidate, the Democratic votes aren't accounted for. So I think it's valid.
Sorry to interrupt. I would say that the question kind of puts two things together. It talks about voter suppression, and it talks about people not voting because they're unmotivated and they feel like their vote doesn't count. And I think I'd like to separate those two. Those are two separate issues. People not coming out to vote because they feel like their vote doesn't matter, I wouldn't call that suppression, but I would call it a bad thing. And I think you have evidence that it happens, that in states that are battleground states, turnout is significantly higher than in states that are not battleground states, states that are safe states like New Jersey, like New York, like California, like Texas, because for the obvious reason, when people think their vote matters, which it does in the battleground states, they're more likely to vote. When they think their vote doesn't matter, they're less likely to vote. Voter suppression is a separate issue. And it's a very bad thing itself. It is, it's not the fault of people not being motivated. It's the fault of lawmakers who want to prevent certain types of people from voting. But I will say one thing about voter suppression, which is this is another problem that the Electoral College makes worse. And that's because states get the number of electors they get no matter how many people in their state vote. If every single eligible voter votes, they get the same number of electoral votes as if 10 people vote. So they have no incentive right now to crack down on voter suppression or to not suppress votes because they get the same number of electoral votes. If it were a national popular vote, suddenly their voter suppression would mean fewer people in their state would be voting. And I think that changes their calculus.
This question was directed at you, Jesse, but either can take this. Is the Electoral College biased to a certain class of Americans, such as race, income, gender, and descent?
Is the Electoral College biased? I mean, yeah, so it favors, as we've said, it favors the people who live in battleground states. Mm-hmm. Battleground states are whiter, older, and I believe more conservative on average than the country as a whole. So in that sense, it does bias in favor of those categories. The winner-take-all rule makes. Oh yeah, thank you. I love this map because it shows you. If you're looking at this map, the thing that says cartogram is actually a representation of the country, but corrected for by population, where people actually live, and whom they support. So blue, darker blue means more Democratic, darker red means more Republican, and purple means in between. So people often talk about things with regard to the map on the left, and they say, oh my God, look, the country is all red with just a little dots of blue. Of course, the dots of blue are where most people live. So when you represent that in a map, suddenly you realize, oh, the country is a lot more evenly divided than is often represented. So the Electoral College does bias. It does have biases. I think it sort of can depend on which states are the battleground states. It's not such a clear, like, it always biases against Black people, or it's always biased against women, or it's always biased against whatever. It's not as simple as that.
I see. So we have time for just a couple more questions. Students want to know, what would be the first step towards changing the Electoral College? I know this is really tough. We talked about the National Popular Vote Compact, but I think a lot of the students watching this really want to know if there is any kind of path in a different direction. So what might you suggest?
Do you want me to go first, or you want to take this one, Allyson?
Yeah, let's let you go first.
I mean, so the National Popular Vote Compact, it's a mouthful, but it's really a simple idea, and it is really what it refers to as an agreement among states. States enter into these compacts all the time. There's dozens, if not hundreds of them right now that are in effect around the country for different issues. This one is just an agreement among states to award their electors in a different way than they do right now. Remember what we said, which is that states have total control over how they award their electors. Right now, all states but 2 award their electors based on who wins the most votes in their state. They give all of their electors to whoever wins the most votes in their state. And what this compact says, the states that join it agree to give all of their votes instead to the candidate who wins the most votes in all 50 states and DC combined. And when states representing a majority of electoral votes in the country, which is 270, that's what you need to become president, is 270 electoral votes. When states representing that number of electoral votes join together in this agreement, then automatically the candidate who wins the most votes in the country becomes the president. And that solves this problem that Allyson and I have been talking about all along, which is that battleground state problem, the problem where presidents and presidential candidates of both parties spend all their time talking to people in Pennsylvania or Florida or Wisconsin or Arizona. Those states aren't less important than any others, but they're more important than any others. So what we want to happen is for the candidate who has to represent the entire country to have to win the votes of the entire country, and not just the votes of a few voters in those sort of key battleground states.
And I think the compact, it's more of a feasible method than going through the regular amendment process. Because clearly, like how you were saying after the 1968 election, I mean, it was possible, but the amendment was filibustered in the Senate. So I feel like these days, especially where partisan politics is pretty high, it's likely that you're not going to really get much through an amendment process.
Right. And sorry, to be clear, that compact is actually 15 years into, it's been going for 15 years now, and it has 15 states that have joined it, as well as DC. Those states all combined equal 196 electoral votes. So that means they only have 74 more before they get to 270, and the agreement takes effect. They all give their electors to the popular vote winner, and then the national popular vote winner, and then you have a national popular vote for president. So I would say, if you're saying the first step, I would say encourage your state lawmakers, because they're the ones who have to choose to adopt this agreement. Encourage them, if they have not already joined the agreement, to look into it and to bring it up as a bill in your own state legislature.
And I think a lot of the states that are part of this compact right now are sort of like traditionally blue, but right before the 2016 election, there were a few red states that were sort of about to join this, right? And then they kind of said, never mind.
Yep.
All right, so we have one more question. I'm actually going to go back to our student questions, and we're going to have we're going to ask our final question from Kennedy. So let's take a look at Kennedy's question, and we'll close out answering that one.
Hi, my name's Kennedy Warmay, and I go to Lake Oswego High School. My question is for Allyson Waller. If the Electoral College does get abolished, how do you think that will affect the future outcomes of elections?
Well, first off, I think it would motivate probably more people to get involved. This goes back to what we were kind of discussing earlier, how the Electoral College may motivate people not to get as involved as people would probably want them to get involved in national elections. I also think how we spoke about earlier, that there would be a greater focus on issues that are of importance to the country as a whole, not just, like a few of the battleground states up north. So I think, it would put pressure too on, candidates to, I think, in a sense, work harder for people's votes. It wouldn't just be left up to, like I said, a few states, and they wouldn't have to focus on a select few of issues that is not uniform to the country as a whole.
It's a great question, and in my book, which I hope you'll read, I think it's very readable. I hope it is. That's how I tried to write it. I spend the last chapter of the book talking to campaign managers, the very people who have to run presidential campaigns, both Democratic and Republican campaign managers, about how they would run their campaigns differently if they had to win a popular vote and not the Electoral College. And as Allyson said, they would become candidates who reached out to all voters everywhere and who were concerned with issues that appealed to most voters and not just slivers of voters in a few states. So they would, by definition, have to become more moderate. They would have to aim more toward the center of the country. By center, I mean political center, not geographic center. They would have to aim towards what most Americans wanted, because that would be how they would win their votes. And that's really key. That means that more people get involved because they know that their votes matter. They would come out more. I think you could have a turnout of tens of millions of more Americans if they knew that their vote actually mattered and they didn't just have to sit home because they live in a safe state. I think that's a really good thing. And I also think, not to belabor the point, and it sounds like a joke, but the one way it will affect the future outcome of an election is the candidate who gets the most votes will win. And, that sounds kind of crazy right now, but in fact, it's the way we run every election in this country except for the presidential election. And I think it confers legitimacy on the winner to be the choice of the most people. When you have the winner is the choice of not the most people, of a minority of the people, I think you really run into problems of democratic legitimacy. And I think that's not a healthy thing going forward for a modern representative democracy like ours.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you very much for taking a little bit of extra time out of your schedule to help us answer these questions. We had literally hundreds of questions from students. I do want to, one more time, thank you, Allyson Waller and Jesse Wegman, for joining us today. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for the great questions.
Yes, I enjoyed it very much. This was fun.
You give me hope for the future of the country. Not much gives me hope these days, but you give me hope.
Thank you very much. So also, I just want to let everybody know today's webinar was produced by Rachel Manley and Callie Holterman. Additional support was provided by our team at the Learning Network, Michael Goncher, Catherine Schulten, Natalie Crew, Jeremy Engel, and Nicole Daniels. And on behalf of the Learning Network, I'm Ross Flatt. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.